That the age is now senile, the world itself testifies to its own decline by giving manifold concrete evidences of the process of decay. There is a diminution in the winter rains that give nourishment to the seeds of the earth, and in the summer heats that ripen the harvests. The springs have less freshness, and the autumns less fecundity. The mountains, disemboweled and worn out, yield a lower output of marble. The mines, exhausted, furnish a smaller stock of precious metals. The veins are impoverished, and they shrink daily. There is a decrease and deficiency of farmers in the field, of sailors on the sea, of soldiers in the barracks, of honesty in the marketplace, of justice in court, of concord in friendship, of skill in technique, of strictness in morals. Anything that is near its end and is verging towards its decline and fall is bound to dwindle. This is the sentence that has been passed upon the world. This loss of strength and loss of stature must end, at last, in annihilation. Joseph Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies is essential reading for anyone interested in the topic of societal collapse. He has thoroughly researched the existing literature on the subject, and this comprehensively referenced book presents an explanation that has the elegant simplicity that is so often the shadow of truth. Stated as concisely as possible, the argument follows. Societies are problem-solving organizations. Social political systems require energy for their maintenance. Increased complexity carries with it increased cost per capita. An investment in social political complexity as a problem-solving response often reaches a point of declining marginal returns. Initial problems that can initiate the evolution of a society could include the need to organize agricultural or irrigation works, the need to process information, and the emergence of surplus and trade, as well as internal and external conflict. In order to solve these problems, the classic hunter-gatherer formation of human societies needed to become more complex. Complexity is generally understood to refer to such things as the size of a society, the number and distinctiveness of its parts, the variety of social roles that it incorporates, the number of distinct social personalities present, and the variety of mechanisms for organizing these into a coherent and functioning whole. Tainter demonstrates how other explanations for collapse are insufficient or can be incorporated within our current argument. Resource depletion is often given as a reason behind societal collapse. However, there are situations where the pressure of resource constraints provokes economic expansion. For example, the switching from wood to coal as a primary heat source in England during the Industrial Revolution. Resource depletion is a threat when a society is already experiencing declining marginal returns on its investment, as it will be unlikely to be able to capitalize on new energy sources. If a society has ever succumbed to a single catastrophe, it must have been an event of truly colossal magnitude. Many societies have recovered from natural disasters, famines, or military setbacks. If a society is unable to recover from such occurrences, it is likely it is already suffering from diminishing marginal returns. Failure to adapt to circumstances is often cited as a reason for collapse. However, the lives of some inhabitants may actually improve under the collapse, i.e. peasant farmers in Gaul during the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So the failure to adapt theory doesn't consider that collapse is in fact itself the adaptation, particularly once a society has reached the point of diminishing marginal returns. Other complex societies or barbarian intruders are usual suspects, but it is unlikely that a complex society would fall to either of these until it had already reached the point of diminishing returns. Peasant uprisings rarely occur without the collusion of some other strata of society, and while they may endure a high tax level, they are increasingly less likely to do so when diminishing marginal returns mean that a consistent rate of tax means less surplus each year. When marginal returns are rising, conflict can be forestalled, as opportunity exists for all classes for economic improvement. Tainter considers Spengler and Toynbee, but I would argue that, particularly in the case of Toynbee, what he is describing in terms of the cultural breakdown of a civilization is similar, but in important ways vastly different from Tainter's definition of collapse, whereas one can be investigated empirically, the other cannot, and I wouldn't consider these theories to be mutually exclusive. Neither benign nor oppressive regimes can long endure a siege of declining marginal returns, although oppressive regimes may be able to endure somewhat longer. Declining marginal returns can arise from any of the following situations: benefits constant, costs rising; benefits rising, costs rising faster; benefits falling, costs constant; and benefits falling, but costs rising. Tainter investigated many modern industries and found that diminishing marginal returns is generally the rule.
A number of years ago, I looked at medicine to see if we could pick up a trend of diminishing returns there. And in fact, we do. We spend more and more to improve general health by smaller and smaller increments. The productivity index here was simply life expectancy divided by proportion of GDP allocated to medical care. This is a problem that's interested me for a number of years. I first began working on it or thinking about it back in 1983. But I wasn't able to really investigate it in detail until recently when I met a couple of colleagues who actually had a database from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. One of them is Dr. Deborah Strumsky, who's pictured here. The other is Dr. Jose Lobo, who doesn't like to have his picture shown. They have a database of U.S. patents that they have put together that allows us to study the productivity of innovation. It's a database that's just remarkable. It has over 5 million patents in it, and of these, more than 50% come from outside the United States. Of course, someone in Japan or China or France invents something that they might want to sell in the United States, they get a U.S. patent on it. So the fact that over 50% of the patents come from outside the United States means that the database, the U.S. patent database, is actually monitoring worldwide innovation. So let's go through some of the results that we found. Our first result, as we expected, is an increase in the average size of patenting teams, perhaps leveling off here, although I'm not so sure, which reflects the increasing complexity of the research enterprise. But as the size of patenting team grows, the output, which is measured as patents per inventor, has been declining. And declining, it appears, inexorably over this entire period. So over a period of years here, the average length of an individual scientist's career, the productivity declined by more than 20%. In fact, I think the exact figure was productivity has declined by 22% within a generation. Now, it's common for older technical fields to become less productive in innovation. This has been known for many decades, but we've assumed that this was offset by higher productivity and innovation in newer technical sectors. To investigate whether this is so, we've studied a selection of both older and newer technical sectors. I'll go through these briefly. I don't want to dwell on them. This is a technical sector of surgery and medical instruments, metalworking and optics. These are older fields in which there are still active programs of innovation. Again, the lines track patents per inventor per year. Here's various areas of drugs and chemicals. Again, you can see the pattern. This chart is energy, and it's perhaps one of the more disturbing ones. Energy, of course, is the most important factor in our future, yet in each sector that we show here, we're experiencing diminishing productivity to innovation. This is the case even in solar and wind technologies, which are these two bottom ones here. You can see in solar and wind the effect of the end of tax credits in the early years of the Reagan administration, but what's disturbing is that the trend has continued downhill since then. And it's possible, what this chart suggests is that it's possible that these fields are already approaching technical maturity. We looked at the newest, computer technology, information technology and communications, which have driven our economies for much of the past 20 to 30 years. Again, you can see the pattern that there is diminishing returns to innovation efforts here. The newest technical sectors are where we would expect to see increasing returns. We'd expect to see the trend line going upward to the right, biotechnology and nanotechnology. But in fact, even in these new technical sectors, which were recognized only in 1980, we see exactly the same pattern as in other sectors. We see that from the inception, these fields are showing diminishing productivity in research.
The Roman Empire was funded by a succession of military conquests that helped finance ever-increasing complexity until the empire reached its greatest geographical extent around 117 AD when Hadrian became emperor. With further expansion uneconomical, the cost of maintaining the empire fell to the largely peasant agricultural population. No longer receiving huge influxes of gold from captured foreign cities, most emperors debased the currency in order to pay the bills of the empire. The Roman equivalent of money printer goes brr. Once society is struggling to even maintain the status quo, it becomes increasingly vulnerable to crisis. High taxes and plague had severely reduced the agricultural workforce, further reducing the empire's economic base and peasant support for the Romans. Decreased manpower and wealth led to military setbacks, which in turn led to further decreases in manpower and wealth. By the 5th century AD, men were ready to abandon civilization itself in order to escape the fearful load of taxes. The weaknesses of the empire that were exposed when Marcus Aurelius confronted the Marcomanni proved nearly fatal during the succeeding crises. The reduced marginal return on organizational investment left the Roman Empire without sufficient reserves to meet such emergencies. The only alternatives were to raise taxes directly or to raise them indirectly by debasement and inflation. Both courses were adopted, and yet the crises of civil war and barbarian incursions required increased expenditures that yielded no increased return. The empire was not expanded, no major booty was acquired, and there was no increase in agricultural output. The increased costs of the 3rd century were incurred merely to maintain the status quo. Costs rose precipitously, while benefits at best remained level. Axiomatically, the marginal return on investment in empire declined. Tikal is the most thoroughly researched of the lowland Maya sites and gives us fascinating insight into the collapse of this mysterious civilization. At the end of the late Classic period, around 800 AD, the city may have had as many as 90,000 inhabitants. What could possibly have caused this thriving metropolis to be abandoned just 200 years later? The collapse caused the population of Tikal to drop by over 90%. And the lowland Maya civilization may have been reduced from 3 million to just 450,000 over a 75-year period. Prior to this, a noticeable increase in monumental architecture is likely to have placed considerable strains on a society that would already have been suffering from diminishing marginal returns. As a population impinges upon the capacity of its food system, fluctuations in productivity become increasingly consequential. In environments characterized by high topographic diversity, where food procurement systems with different productivity cycles exist in close proximity, it is common to alleviate resource fluctuations by developing regional systems of economic symbiosis, or trade. The topological redundancy of the lowland environment created a situation where highly diversified production systems were not likely to exist in any local setting, and where neighboring populations would be experiencing nearly the same productivity cycles. When population in the pre-classic era, around 50 BC, became sufficiently dense, the productivity fluctuations were a matter of serious concern. The solution to each local group so affected became obvious: raid neighboring groups to make up a deficit. Long-term solutions included agricultural intensification and the establishment of a hierarchically managed economy, but these were not permanent solutions, for the archaeologically evident pattern of population growth indicates that with each establishment of a higher capacity production system, population simply rose further. The military option must have been perpetually tempting. Although we do not have the details of how Tikal and the civilization of the lowland Maya met their demise, we know from the end of the late classic period no major monuments were built, and that there is evidence that elite palaces may have been burned. It is clear that it was a political and demographic disaster of the greatest magnitude. The Chacoan society began in the San Juan Basin around the 5th century AD, culminating in its zenith at around 1100 AD, only to collapse just 50 years later. In the center of the San Juan Basin lies its major topographic feature, Chacao Canyon, an island of topographic relief and environmental variety in a sea of homogeny and redundancy. Around this, a trading network was developed that centered on a series of great houses, with as many as 700 to 800 rooms, that were home to the elites of Chacoan society. The largest of these were in Chacao Canyon, with the rest scattered along the periphery of the basin and along the lower Chacao River. As many as 70 of these Chacoan outliers have been identified. A three-level economic hierarchy appears to have operated in the basin. Elites resident in outliers mediated the participation of local agricultural villages in the system, and interacted directly with the regional elites resident in canyon great houses. Resources exchanged up and down through this hierarchy would have included agricultural crops, firewood, building materials, animal products, wild plant products, stone and pottery, and such extra basin resources as cotton, salt, and turquoise. By 1100 AD, the increase in the number of outliers, each requiring construction of a great house, had reduced the average distance between them and increased the numbers in the less productive and less diverse areas of the basin. With declining distance between outliers, more and more Chacoan towns were established that experienced productivity cycles similar to their ever closer neighbors. As participants in the energy averaging system became spatially closer, their productivity fluctuations grew increasingly synchronized. After enough outliers had been established in the region to maximally exploit its environmental diversity, the addition of each new one reduced the overall effectiveness of the system. It is highly likely that outliers would have begun to withdraw from this trade network, particularly those at the southern edge of the basin where the most productive agricultural land was. Lacking true coercive force, the canyon administrators could not enforce participation. leaving only the weaker ones less able to survive on their own, with less to contribute to the regional pool. The collapses of these societies cannot be understood solely by reference to their environments and subsistence practices, to the pressures of outside peoples, to internal conflict, to population growth, to catastrophes, or to socio-political dysfunction. What affected the Romans, Maya, and Chacoans so adversely was how one or more of these factors was related to the cost-benefit ratio of investment in complexity. When challenges and stresses caused this ratio to deteriorate excessively, or coincided with a declining marginal return, collapse became increasingly likely. Complex societies are an anomaly of human history, and so often require constant reinforcements of their legitimacy. And while collapse does not occur in a power vacuum, continuing declining marginal returns will cause a decreasing general standard of living for the populace as regimes expend more energy to maintain the status quo, and collapse in response to a crisis event becomes ever more likely. Our modern world undoubtedly represents human society at its greatest level of complexity. Despite the wonders of human ingenuity, surely we will reach our point of diminishing marginal returns to complexity, if we have not already. It is all well and good to lower consumption, but a society as complex as our global political system requires some minimal investment of energy to maintain its basic functions. Tainter indicates that collapse is most devastating to societies where the majority of the population lack the opportunity or ability to produce primary foodstuffs. Currently, society is buttressed against collapse by the global nature of complex systems, but this new era of deglobalization could potentially create power vacuums. Otherwise, we are likely to continue to stumble from one crisis to the next, increasing in complexity to the benefit of elites, while diminishing marginal returns reduce what is available for the rest of the population, and precipitating a gradual decline in living standards. At least we can be thankful that the instigators of net zero will be doing all they can to lighten the burden.
So I'm going to throw this immediately out to the audience and say, how many of you are driving an electric vehicle at the moment? 1, 2, 3, 4. So I would say that probably constitutes less than 5% of the persons sitting here in this room.